Freud was an unusually complicated man in a way. There were ways in which he was extremely dogmatic and arrogant, and ways in which he was unusually open-minded. One of the things that's striking about him compared to, I think, many intellectual giants is that he actually changed his mind about some very key issues 2 or 3 different times at least in the course of his career. One example of where he changed his mind very radically is that for much of his life he thought that he had this idea of repression, that we put unpleasant thoughts, memories, ideas out of our mind very actively. We don't just forget them, we actively put them out of our mind. And he noticed that people who do that often had a lot of anxiety. And the way he understood it is we put stuff out of our mind, it still kind of bottles up, builds up pressure like a pressure cooker, and then that pressure finally sort of pops out as anxiety, as agitation, and so on. Towards the end of his life, he actually reversed the entire structure of that. He decided that it wasn't repression that caused anxiety, it was anxiety that caused repression. That we put things out of our mind because we're afraid of them. And so he, in a way, turned his entire theory upside down. He had once said that repression is the very cornerstone of his theory. And then he shifted the cornerstone. So this is an example of the flexibility. At the same time, even after he made this major change, he didn't really change that much the way he worked with patients. It was like he created a revolution, but he didn't attend the revolution. And so for at least 50 years after that, psychoanalysts would acknowledge this change, but they didn't really understand that it meant they had to practice differently. So these are the two sides of how. I think in some way my sense is he led a very almost hyper-ordinary life. For a man who was such a revolutionary thinker, who was challenging so many of the mores of his society, who was entering into the sort of deepest, darkest recesses of the psyche, it seems like he led a life that today we might think was rather boring. He worked very hard. There were rumors about him and his sister-in-law. I don't know how true they are. But even that, in fact, is not that out of the ordinary. Not literally, but I think all in all what's striking is how much he, all the pictures we have of him, he's wearing a suit like I am now. But I don't always wear a suit. I have the sense that he always wore a suit. He was he was certainly not a hippie of his day, though he was in certain ways the inspiration for the hippies a century later. Well, there have been people who have...
I just want to stress one thing.
Mm-hmm.
My questions are edited out,
Mm-hmm.
so you have to incorporate them into your
Right.
answers.
Right.
Please go on.
Okay. There have been people who have used Freud's ideas to promote the sale of products, to understand the hidden fantasies that people gratify when they buy a product, and so on. And in that sense, his ideas have contributed to the overgrowth of consumerism in our lives. But his ideas really also hold the key to the most important critique of consumerism, because the way we live now, which has such enormous environmental consequences, which is causing the very weather to change and polluting the air and so on, is all a product of our needing to buy more. And we do that because we think buying each of these things will make us happier, will make us feel better. And economists keep insisting that we know exactly what we want, that we know what's good for us, that we make very wise, witting choices. Freud shows us how little we really know about what we want, how able we are to deceive ourselves, to fool ourselves into thinking we want one thing when really we want something else, to hide inconvenient experiences from our awareness. And one of the most inconvenient experiences for capitalism is that most of these things we buy don't really bring us very much satisfaction. And you can look in anybody's closet, and 90% of the stuff in there they hardly ever use, but they keep buying more of it, thinking this time it'll make me happy. And Freud was most of all the prophet of self-deception. And capitalism is rooted in the idea that we know exactly what we want. So there's a very fundamental clash there. Freud viewed his theories not just as an adjunct of medicine, not just as a guide to treating people with disorders. He viewed it as a really new way of understanding human experience and as potentially having an enormous impact on the society at large. So I think and I hope he would be appalled to see what we have made of our society by denying self-deception, most of all, by following the dictates of Freud's most important competitor, which is the economists. Many people say we live in a post-Freudian world, and in many ways we do, but economists live in a pre-Freudian world. Economists live in a world, and they sell this to us. They sell it to corporations, they sell it to government officials, they sell it to the population. A vision that we know what we want. We don't make mistakes. We are rational creatures. That was a wonderful philosophy in the 18th century. It was part of the Enlightenment that moved things forward. But Freud helped us to see there are severe limits to that. But what we have is, in a way, two societies. We have a society that lives in a way by Freudian premises, and it governs certain aspects of our private lives where we are more liberated than we used to be. And we have a society that lives by the economist's premises and denies the degree of conflict and self-deception that characterizes our lives. And that's part of what entraps us in consumerism. Because consumerism is founded on self-deception. There are many studies that show as the economy grows, as people have more and more, they just don't feel better. It doesn't really make us feel better about our lives. What does make us feel better about our lives is connections with other human beings, connections with a larger purpose, things that I think Freud understood a lot more than the economists do. Well, there's a widespread view, which I actually think is wrong, that Freud was a kind of advocate of a libertine way of life, of expressing all our impulses, having what we want when we want it, living impulsively just for pleasure. If that were Freud's message, that would be very consistent with all the messages associated with consumerism. I actually don't think that was Freud's message. I think Freud was, in many ways, deeply suspicious and afraid of the depths that he discovered, and in certain ways was a rather conservative man who felt we needed to live within limits, who was not an advocate of unrestrained expression of impulses. I think where people get confused is he was an advocate of knowing about those impulses. He was an advocate of knowing what we want. But I would actually, as a psychotherapist, I've actually been critical of Freud for being too suspicious of our deepest impulses, for seeing them as too dangerous. And I think in some way in the realm of psychotherapy, what we need instead is a greater acceptance of the feelings that we have, and a way of working with them that doesn't view them as so dangerously primitive. But for Freud, the deepest well springs of our motivations were really dangerous, and he was not really an advocate of just let it all hang out and get what you want immediately. He felt that would be a recipe for disaster. Well, I think Freud did create a liberating force in the sense that so much of the morality of our society, of the society he lived in the society 100 years ago, so much of that was based on a kind of condemnation of fundamentals of human nature. And I think Freud did contribute to our being more accepting, for example, of sexuality, of the search for pleasure. And I think there were and have been threads of people trying to create lives in which pleasure and sexuality and a whole range of intense feelings are included as part of human nature rather than denied. And that was liberating. Freud himself, I don't think, lived in a terribly liberated way. He was like today's investment bankers and corporate lawyers. He worked too hard. If he had been my patient, I would have tried to help him work less hard. But we're probably better off because he did a lot. Well, I think comparing Freud to Einstein is a little unfair. I'm a basketball fan, so if I see a really great basketball player, I don't want to dismiss him if he's just not quite Michael Jordan. I mean, Einstein was Michael Jordan. But Freud was, I think, one of the great figures of the 20th century. And I think partly because it is almost hard to imagine what was not recognized before Freud. There were individuals, also geniuses, who did see before Freud what he did, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, people like that. But Freud was certainly the first person to use that, to harness it for actually helping relieve human suffering, to help people overcome problems that had been essentially untreatable before, through his understanding of the underlying conflicts that govern our behavior and our experience. And there were enormous discoveries in that realm, and in the ability to systematize it, even though he got some of it wrong. The very project of developing a scientific study that was not based on sort of boring and obvious things, but that was brilliantly interesting, that was something new in a systematic way. And Freud was a brilliant interpreter. There were so many examples, especially in some of his books like The Interpretation of Dreams and The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, where he takes just sort of homespun examples of the small things we do that may seem just a little bit odd, and probes them in ways to find meanings that really weren't evident before. And he had a wonderful ear for meanings. He could discern meanings where other people just wouldn't notice. And by now, some of that skill has been imparted to the rest of us more mortal psychologists and psychoanalysts. So I think now I might well see some of the things that Freud was the first to see. If I listen to a patient, I hear things, I hope pretty perceptively, but I don't think I could have without Freud's guidance to begin with. I think if I were a 19th century person listening to the same stories that my patients told, so much of what now seems obvious to me just wouldn't have been. So his genius really lay in making obvious what's now obvious, but was far from obvious before. It's really hard to evaluate exactly how he's changed people's lives, particularly because he certainly has changed the lives of people like me, obviously, especially as a professional psychologist, but also as an intellectual, as somebody who likes to read and think. There's a large subset of people who see the world differently now. I think there probably are millions and millions and really billions of people around the world whose lives are exactly the same as they would have been if Freud had never been born. I think we do have to acknowledge that. And that's one of the differences between, say, Freud and Einstein. Einstein was responsible even for something as simple as the GPS in our cars, which actually work via the theory of relativity. You can't escape Einstein. Billions of people in the world do escape Freud. I mean, there are billions of people in the world living in places where nobody's ever heard of Freud and where it didn't even filter in. But I think in upper middle class, advanced industrial information economies, Freud's way of thinking has seeped into ours a lot. What's very interesting, if you look in universities, for example, just to start with, Freud is very much alive in departments like literature, comparative literature, and cultural studies, and so forth. Oddly, he's less apparent in most psychology departments. And that's because most psychologists have become preoccupied with a very, very narrow form of empiricism, where the only thing they're really willing to talk about is what can be determined in a very limited set of methodologies and studies. And for those people, Freud is aversive because Freud had the speculative kind of mind that psychologists, empirical psychologists, are often suspicious of. I happen to be fortunate. I teach in a psychology department where Freud is very much present and feel very fortunate about that. I think that our language is infused with Freudian ideas. You know, people talk about somebody with a big ego. People talk about repression. People talk about all sorts of terms that come out of Freud, even superego, which is a very technical term. And people now assume that sexuality is a very central part of our lives. People assume that relationships between people are more complicated and conflicted than our great-grandparents told us they were. There is, again, just a subset, but an important subset of people, an attitude of questioning that is partly the heritage of Freud, though of many other influences as well. There are just the very assumption that psychological difficulties can be treated is very largely a heritage of Freud. I mean, it's an interesting thing to notice the history of Freud's own development. Freud was not a psychologist. He was not even a psychiatrist. He was a neurologist. He studied the nervous system initially. And so people who came to see him, they came to see a medical doctor. And they had to kind of bring a medical or quasi-medical complaint in order to have a sort of ticket to his office. One of the remarkable things he accomplished was that after 10 or 15 years of doing this and of illuminating the inner life of people, people started bringing to him, and now for decades to people like me, problems that have nothing to do with this hurts or that hurts or I can't move this limb, but have to do with I worry about this, I feel bad about that, I can't fall in love, my work isn't meaningful. Nobody would have ever thought of those kinds of problems as problems to bring to a quasi-medical practitioner before Freud. Freud so transformed our understanding of what's possible for human beings that we now almost forget that Freud didn't start out treating those kinds of problems because they weren't even recognized as psychological problems. They were recognized, they were viewed as moral problems, as limits of character that could be dismissed, as the human condition maybe, but not as something treatable, and especially not as something treatable significantly through self-examination and reflection. And the power of self-examination and reflection as an actual formal practice, very much, Freud was not the only person ever to advocate that. You can go back as far, at least, as Montaigne, who apparently kind of did what we might call today a self-analysis long before Freud. Maybe we could go back to the Greeks even. But as a really institutionalized part of our society, there was something really revolutionary about what Freud started. That I've thought about that one. I'm not doing much for what's on camera here because I don't think you can use this, but I've thought about that question you raised, since you raised it in the email. And it's one that I'm not sure I really do know how to answer in a significant way. So
all right.
I'm going to pass on that one.
All right, no problem.
Well, what I meant by drawing a connection between Freud and the hippie movement was that the hippies were kind of trying to live a life that was truer to their impulses, in a sense. And again, Freud himself was not an advocate of living impulsively, but what he unleashed led to visions of there being more going on underneath than we had acknowledged, and it could easily make everyday bourgeois life look kind of gray and colorless, and the hippies sort of took that aspect of Freud's ideas. They weren't, in any sense, true disciples of Freud, so to speak, but I think they were in some way one effect of Freud's ideas.